Hi folks, Paul here again from Pinnacle English Learn, and today we're going to talk about IELTS. I'm going to give you some tips and tricks to maximize your score on the IELTS exam, and these tips and tricks have been given to me by IELTS examiners, or should I say ex-IELTS examiners. So I think it'll be an interesting insight into what examiners expect from candidates that sit for the IELTS exam. And I'd like to start off with a very quick quote from a really cute movie called The Pursuit of Happiness. And I think this is particularly pertinent for those of you that are going to do the IELTS exam and are going to start studying for it. Guys, don't ever let anyone tell you you can't do something. If you've got a dream, you have to protect it. When people tell you you can't do something, it's because they can't do it themselves. You want something? Go get it, period. The whole point of that, guys, is don't let anyone tell you you can't achieve the score on that IELTS exam that you need. Listen to yourself first and foremost. If you believe that you can do it, then you probably will. All right? So don't let anyone put you down. Don't let anyone tell you that you can't do something. So we'll just very quickly go through our table of contents here. And we're going to start by telling you about us. In other words, who we are and what we do. Then we'll go into some IELTS uses. Specifically, we'll just look at the differences between the general paper versus the academic paper. We'll look at the reading exam, and it is different or slightly different for academic versus general. And we'll give you an idea of the structure and some tips. And again, speaking, the same thing, structure and tips. Speaking, guys, is the same for both general and academic. As is listening. Listening is the same for both general and academic. And we'll give you some information about it in terms of the structure, and also give you some tips from ex-IELTS examiners. And last, but certainly not least, probably one of the toughest papers that candidates and certainly our students find, and that's the writing paper. We'll look at the academic section versus the general section for writing, or the general paper for writing, and we'll tell you about the structure of it, and we'll give you some tips about writing as well. So firstly, about us, you can find us at pinnacleenglishlearn.com, and I'll just quickly go to our website here and show you how to book in. So if you want to, you can just go to our free trial lesson, and you can bring someone with you. You can bring up to 4 people with you to that lesson. Or you can just come by yourself to do a one-on-one lesson. It's free of charge. It's only about 15 minutes long, and it just gives you an idea about, what learning online is like. So when you click confirm, you'll get a text message from us and an email with the details about how to join your online lesson. Now, let's get stuck into this presentation, which includes some IELTS tips from ex-IELTS examiners. Are you ready? I know I am. We'll start with the general paper, and the general IELTS exam is generally used for working and living in an English-speaking country. So IELTS, the academic IELTS, some people are using it for visa purposes, but generally it's used for studying in an English-speaking country, studying in an English-speaking university, or any other tertiary institution. And just a quick overview of the test takers. I'll just quickly go back here. So in terms of gender, you can see 53% of the people that took the IELTS exam in 2019 were females, and 47% were males. And in terms of the academic versus general, you can see far more people there. 77% took the academic paper, as opposed to 23% that took the general paper. So that's significantly less people that took the general IELTS exam. The differences In terms of the speaking, it's exactly the same, guys. There's no difference between when you take, if you enroll for an academic IELTS exam or a general IELTS exam, they're both exactly the same in terms of the speaking paper. The listening section or the listening exam is exactly the same. And then the reading, well, for academic, the topics are more complex. So it is more challenging. I don't want to use the word difficult, but, in reality, the academic exam, although it's the same length, it's more difficult. And for writing, the academic writing paper, particularly part 1, is completely different from the general paper. And I'll go through this a little bit later. Part 2, for academic and general, it's the same type of question. In other words, it's an essay question. However, the academic question is generally more complex and hence more challenging. So there you have the uses of IELTS. And now we're going to take a look at the different papers. And we're going to give you some tips that should help you to maximize that score of yours. Ready? Okay, so moving right along. And we'll start with the reading section. And I've just written here, keep calm and read on. And I think that's really important. The fact is, guys, this is an exam. You're only human. But if you can just try and remain calm and don't get stuck on questions which you find to be really difficult, then it'll help you in the long term in terms of just finishing that exam, getting it done, and also moving on to questions that perhaps you find to be less challenging. By the end, hopefully you'll have calmed down enough to tackle the more difficult questions that you had to move on from. The reading exam is 60 minutes long, and I've put 1 hour there for you. So the time is 60 minutes, and probably the most challenging bit or the most challenging part of the reading exam is actually the time. It's not very long, and running out of time is an issue. People tend to, deliberate and take too long on certain sections. And that's why it's important to just keep moving through that reading exam so that you can get it finished within that time limit. And questions, there are 40 questions altogether. One of the parts of the training that we provide is to actually complete the reading task within the hour. The sections, well, there are 3 sections altogether, and we'll go through what these entail in the next few slides. So section 1, it's an easy text with several sections. Then there's section 2, more difficult. It's a bit more difficult in terms of the text. And section 3 is one long difficult text. Okay, so here are some IELTS examiner tips when it comes to that reading paper. And look, this is, relevant to both the general paper and the academic paper. In terms of the questions, there's a variety of question types, and the actual type, the type determines whether you read quickly or more carefully. Do not try and read every single word or understand every single word. And in fact, don't read the whole article just because you find it interesting. You don't need to do that. You need to really read for purpose, and you need to find the answers. And an easy way to do this is to move back and forth between the question and the text to try and scan and look for the actual answers as you are reading the questions. So read for purpose. You can underline the keywords and phrases. This works for some people. And by underlining the keywords and phrases, you don't waste time looking for things that you've already read. Moving swiftly along to the speaking paper. And I've always given students this bit of advice, and that is to, when you get into that speaking exam, play the game. IELTS examiners are human beings, so if you can show them that you are relaxed, smile. That always helps me to relax. And really, play the game in terms of engaging and expanding on the ideas that you have when doing the speaking section. All right? So really try and relax, smile, play the game, engage with the examiner, particularly in part 3. Let's have a quick look at some tips and tricks from examiners about the speaking exam. So speaking, relax, the situation is not dangerous, I've put here. So the speaking exam is 15 minutes long, and you've got part 1, which involves some general topics. Part 2, where you're given a card of some sort and you've got to speak uninterrupted for 1 to 2 minutes, but really it's more like 2 minutes, guys. And part 3, this is where the examiner is really looking for you, to really expand on your ideas. And part 3, the questions are linked to a topic on the task card in part 2. So they are topically linked. So here are some more examiner tips for parts 1 and 2. Hopefully you find them useful. So part 1, the examiner really has a strict script. Now, you can ask the examiner to repeat a question once in part 1, only once, one time. The examiner cannot rephrase a question in part 1. However, the examiner can rephrase one word. So if you don't understand a word, the examiner can rephrase that particular word. The examiner might repeat a question in part 1 if the student goes completely off topic. I should say if the candidate goes completely off topic. Now, part 2, the topic in part 2, you should practice with topics that you are not familiar with, because they might come up in that exam. And part 2 is 1 to 2 minutes long, but really, guys, you should aim for 2 minutes in order to maximize your IELTS score. And this is something an examiner mentioned to me, that often, students, they may not feel all that comfortable speaking for 2 minutes, but that's where practice makes perfect. And it's really important that you practice with an IELTS teacher, a teacher who specializes in IELTS, and so that they can help you achieve 2 minutes of speaking uninterrupted by the time you do the exam. So moving along now to part 3, do not talk about yourself in part 3. Generalize in part 3. Don't personalize it. Don't try and memorize a whole answer either. It's pretty obvious to examiners if the students or if the candidates have tried to memorize a whole answer. In part 3, the examiner will dig deeper. In other words, if you give these short answers, the examiner will try and push you to expand upon your ideas so that we can really see, or so that the examiner can really see the production of the language. The examiner can rephrase the entire sentence in part 3. So, it's a bit more. So what I've been told about part 3 is that, examiners are given a bit more flexibility so that in part 3, it's more like a two-way conversation rather than you doing a presentation. There's a bit more kind of give and take, and there's a bit more flexibility from the end of the examiner. So we're moving now to speaking, and speaking has part 1 where you have some general topics which are quite familiar. Examples could be about your hometown, your home city, hobbies, and so on. Part 2 has some less familiar topics, and you'll be given a topic card of some sort where you'll need to do that talk for about 2 minutes long. And part 3 is a bit more abstract and theoretical. And the examiner here is looking for you to expand on your ideas. And moving right along now to listening. And with listening, I've said, make sure you focus on the present and don't think about what you were doing before the test or the listening exam and what you will do after the test. I think quite a few people, we're human, we're only human, and our mind tends to drift. That's quite normal, but during the listening exam, because you only get to hear the recordings once, one time only, it's vital. It's really important that you focus, you stay present, and you listen intently to the information that's coming out of the recording, all right? If you don't, and if your mind wanders, you could miss something, and then because you only hear the recording once, you've missed the answer or several answers in that listening exam, all right? So stay present. Stop thinking about what you did before you went into the test, and don't think about what you're going to do after the test finishes, or in fact after you get the exam results. So listening is 30 minutes altogether in terms of the recording. You're given some time afterwards to transfer your answers. There are 4 sections altogether, and it does get progressively more difficult, as is with pretty much all of the IELTS papers. You know, that's the way it's designed, to kind of start out a little bit easier and then, test your linguistic or language skills as the exam progresses. There are 40 questions altogether in the listening paper. And as I mentioned before, for speaking and listening, it's exactly the same whether you've chosen to do general or academic. It doesn't matter. The students are tested in the same way for both speaking and listening. So the listening sections, there are 4 sections as I mentioned before. The first section is a social conversation, and this is probably the least difficult. The second section is a monologue. In other words, one person speaking. The third section is a professional conversation of some sort. And the fourth section, probably the most difficult, is also a monologue and, from memory, sometimes a lecture of some sort. So there you have it. You've got 4 sections there. And guys, the best thing to do is just practice. Do listening exams. We usually, we do sections with the students, and then, we can certainly share our resources and share entire exams with you so that you can go away and just do some practice of those exams. So, section 6 of this presentation covers writing, and what I've given here, or the advice that I've given here, is to think first, read the essay question, and firstly think, then plan, and then write. And then after you've finished writing, perhaps the most important bit is the editing, or to check your work. If you've got time, guys, it really does pay to check your work afterwards. So once again, think, plan, write, and then check, edit. If you've got time. I know it's only 60 minutes long altogether, and, you're supposed to allocate 20 minutes for part 1 and the rest 40 minutes to part 2. But think, plan, write, and if you've got time, perhaps at the end, check your work to make sure that you can fix up any errors, or particularly any expressive errors. In other words, sentences that don't really make sense when you read them a second time. You'll know what I mean when you practice. So just with the writing, you've got task 1, which is, the minimum word limit there is 150 words. That's the minimum. I've spoken to IELTS examiners or ex-IELTS examiners about this, and they recommend that students should shoot for at least 200 words in order to maximize their IELTS score. So if you really want to shoot for, an IELTS 6 or above, you should really be aiming for about 200 words in task 1 so that you can cover it or cover that task comprehensively. The recommended time for task 1 is 20 minutes. For academic, it's a little bit more difficult. That's just the way it is, because you've got to describe a graph. For general, it's a little bit more straightforward. You've got to write a letter of some sort. So, one of them is more challenging than the other. For task 2, you've got 250 words. Again, the examiners have suggested, or the ex-examiners have suggested, that you write a minimum of 300. The recommended time for this is 40 minutes. So, the recommended time here is 20. If you need to take a little bit longer, I guess you could, but you have to be aware that that will eat into this time here. And for academic, the question it's the same question type. It's an essay of some sort, but for the academic IELTS writing part 2, the questions are more complex, and they probably require a little bit more of a sophisticated response. So guys, 150 words minimum here, 250 words minimum here, 20 minutes recommended here, and 40 minutes recommended here. IELTS examiners do suggest strongly that you shoot for 200 words here in order to cover all of the points. And that's really important, guys, particularly for part 1 academic. So many students are doing that academic IELTS test. And for writing section 1, it's really important that you cover everything. And I'll go through this in a sec. And in order to cover everything, then, it's quite challenging just to do that within 150 words. So, shoot for at least 200, even 250, but I'd say 200 words would probably be enough in order for you to cover everything that's required for you to get a high mark for part 1 of the academic IELTS test in terms of writing. And yeah, you can do them in any order. So if you feel more comfortable starting with task 2 and then working back to task 1, perhaps task 1, the graph just kind of confuses you initially and you start to panic, move on to task 2, get that out of the way, and then jump back to task 1 if you wish. Any order is fine. So here are some examiner tips for the writing paper, for part 1 of the writing paper. You must include an overview. This is for the academic paper, yeah? So this is not for general, guys. This is for academic. So you must include an overview. And we can teach you what an overview is. You really need an IELTS teacher to teach you what an overview is. And you must include all of the key features in the task. Not in the overview, but certainly in the paragraphs that follow the overview. You should include, or you must include, all of the key features in the task itself. And you can include the key features in the body paragraphs. You should group your ideas together. Don't just list everything. Look for patterns and trends and group your ideas together. In order for you to get a high mark in the writing paper or on the writing paper, you need to use complex sentences and synonyms. By complex sentences, I mean, like if clauses, and relative clauses. So an if clause, you guys probably learnt them as conditionals. So if I hadn't met him, I wouldn't have started working at that college. That's an example of an if clause. I've used a sophisticated example there. I've used a third conditional. And a relative clause could be, I'll just give you a simple example. The doctor who I like best is Dr. Smith. So that's an example of a relative clause. And those two are examples of more complex sentences. Alrighty, so moving swiftly along, writing an overview, you must include an overview, as I said before. When you're writing an overview, you need to describe the main things that you see, and it does not have to include all the key features, and I think I mentioned that before. I would start with a word like overall, and I think it's a really good idea to do this, because if you use the word overall to introduce the overview, it's a good indicator for the examiner that you know what you're doing. In other words, if you use that word, overall, comma, and then the rest of it, and I would just include it at the beginning of part 1 of your academic IELTS writing. And I would do that because, you get it out of the way, the examiner sees it, it's clear that you know that you have to include an overview, and you can maximize your mark that way. So IELTS writing general training. Look, the general, as I mentioned before, let's face it, it's easier. That's the bottom line. It's a letter, and the letter can be formal, informal, or semi-formal. So in paragraph 1, you should state the reason for writing this letter. For example, I'm writing this letter because blah, blah, blah. That's just something that you need to do. In terms of like a formal letter, I'm writing this letter because I wish to complain about the noise that is coming from the neighboring school. In the question, you'll have the question for general training part 1 for the writing. You'll have bullet points. You need to address all of the bullet points in that particular task. If you don't, then you will lose marks. Look, that's quite obvious, but some people don't, and they get lazy, and then they wonder why they've lost marks. You need to, otherwise you will lose marks. This is something an examiner has mentioned. And again, you will lose marks if you don't sign off. So you must sign off. You can use best regards, best wishes. It depends on the level of formality, of course. So if it's an informal letter, you could just use cheers. If it's a formal letter, yours faithfully or yours sincerely. Best regards for semi-formal. Writing part 2. Guys, the bottom line is that for writing part 2, it's pretty much the same, whether it's general or academic. But the academic writing part 2, the questions for the academic paper tend to be just more sophisticated, more challenging. So writing part 2, examiner tips. Structure, you've got introduction, body, and conclusion. That's the structure you need to follow. You need to answer the question in terms of the number of body paragraphs, 2 to 3 body paragraphs. Answer the question, read the question carefully, and answer every part of the question, guys. I shouldn't gloss over that because it's vitally important that you read the question carefully for part 2 of that IELTS writing paper. So read the question carefully and answer every part of the question. That's probably one of the most important things. And your opinion, well, you should get that out of the way in the first paragraph. So yes, you should include your opinion and you should include it in the first paragraph. You need to have a position. This is something examiners have told me, that candidates should at least have a position in the first paragraph. If nothing else, you should have a position in that first paragraph. And for body paragraphs, as I mentioned before, 2 or 3 body paragraphs with one main idea in each. Of course, in those body paragraphs, you need topic sentences. That first sentence needs to be a topic sentence. If you're not sure what this is, again, you'll need to do some IELTS training in order for you to write properly or write appropriately for an IELTS exam. And the conclusion, you can summarize, or you should summarize and reiterate the ideas that you've given in your essay, but don't introduce brand new ideas here. However, you can mention, or you can briefly mention, the future. And again, this is something an examiner or an ex-examiner mentioned to me. You shouldn't introduce new ideas in that conclusion. However, if you want to talk about the future as it relates to that particular topic in the essay, then you certainly can. IELTS writing part 2, examiner tips. Look, this is really what the examiners have to work with. They're looking at coherence and cohesion. And coherence refers to, have you written a logical essay and have you used a range of cohesive devices? Some of you guys know these as linking words. However, furthermore, in addition, additionally, and, but, appropriate use and a range of these cohesive devices. Paragraphs, again, an examiner said to me here, tell candidates to please leave a space, or tell students to please leave a space in between each paragraph. It makes such a difference if you guys can leave a space so it's so clear to the IELTS examiner that, okay, new paragraph, new idea. And lexical resource, this just refers to vocabulary or words. You need a variety of words. In other words, using the same words all the time is probably not showing that you have a wide range of vocabulary. So lexical resource, vocabulary resource is another way of expressing this idea. So they're looking for variety, flexibility, and accuracy. So are you using a range of vocabulary? Are you using the vocabulary appropriately? And if you are making mistakes in terms of the spelling, does it really impede communication? Can they understand what you've written? Complex clauses, and I think I touched upon this before, conditionals and relative clauses get you higher marks. So, complex sentences or complex clauses are a way for you guys to maximize or achieve higher marks, particularly, in that writing for the writing paper. So, complex sentences include conditionals and relative clauses. Defining and non-defining relative clauses. Conditionals, well, you have the first conditional, the second, the third, the mixed, the zero. These are all, grammatical structures that you should be able to use appropriately and, accurately in your writing for the IELTS test. Compound sentences. There's a bit of a difference between complex clauses or complex sentences and compound sentences. It's still important to use compound sentences, but, these ones here really get you a higher mark on for the IELTS writing. Compound sentences, include but and. So, these are compound sentences. And that's pretty much it. I know it was a pretty deep dive. Thank you very much for listening to me. So, guys, as I said before, we are online, pinnacleenglishlearn.com. That's our website. Look for us on the various social media platforms, including Facebook. We're now on TikTok. We've got a YouTube channel, and we're also on Instagram as just look for Pinnacle English Learn, basically. If you want to improve your IELTS score or even your PTE score, hit us up, do a trial lesson with us and find out what it's all about. Take care, take it easy, and have a great day. Bye for now, guys. Bye.